Hey guys, so this is kind of flipping the classroom a little bit. Instead of you getting this information in class, I'm going to have it at your home. So you're going to be watching this video. I would certainly recommend that you jot some things down with notes for several reasons. One, it's been proven that if you're writing stuff down physically on a piece of paper, it helps your brain remember better. Two, you can reference that piece of paper when questions pop up at this Edpuzzle. And three, you can also have it to reference later at different points if you might need it. Okay, so this is kind of a lesson on government in general, but also we're going to get more specific on how that looks in Israel. So why talk about government if we're talking about the culture of a country? Well, government has the power to influence quite a bit of things in a country. So if you think about generally what government is, it's a small group of people that can make a lot of big decisions for everyone living there. The general idea of a government is an organization to look out after the citizens, but that's not always the case of what happens. So we're going to cover some government basics as well as apply those basics to how that looks in our country of study right now, which is Israel, but we will be able to apply it to later units as well. So starting off, this should kind of be a review. Hopefully, we know that there are three branches of government. And generally speaking, a lot of times we think of three branches of government for the United States, but really they apply for any country. Okay, that's why I have that written there. And so we're just going to do a quick recap of what these branches of government are and what they do. So the legislative branch of government, I'll give you a quick second to maybe remind yourselves. Sometimes people can recall this. Their general job or role is to make and pass laws. Typically, it's a group of people. So they get together, they decide what laws are needed, and they write them up. And then if enough people vote for them, the law gets passed and becomes real. At that point, you can kind of think of it this way, that the executive branch picks up. The major job or role for the executive branch is to enforce laws. So the executive branch doesn't make the laws, they're supposed to enforce the laws that are already in existence. So they're try to keep people to follow them and do something about it if it looks like people are not following them. Then the third branch is, I'll give you a second to fill in here, judicial, and they interpret laws, okay? And right here we can see that would include judges. So that's the branch of government. They judge things. They decide if people have actually broken the law or not. And even they have the power to decide if the law itself is legal. Okay. So these three branches of government, these are general terms that can be applied to any country in the world and their government. So we got to get good at applying these terms to different countries as we get to them in our topics of study. So the legislative branch, a little bit more into that. So typically, again, you think of the legislative branch as it's a group of people that make and pass laws. It's almost never one person, it's a group. And usually there's a lot of debate, there's a lot of argument, there's a lot of discussion about laws and what laws should be made and what should be on those laws and that sort of thing. So the most common forms let you see a legislative branch come in. So how is that group organized, basically? Many times you might see it as a unicameral organization, that is to say one house. So that group of lawmakers, they're all in one house. And house here doesn't mean a physical house. They're talking about just like how it's organized or how it's structured. And also a very common structure is a bicameral system with two houses. We're two different groups. They're all lawmakers. They all make and pass laws, but they're separated into different groups, okay? Kind of like how you're all seventh graders, but you're separated into different classes. Well, they're all lawmakers. They're separated into different houses, but some systems have just one house. They're all lumped together. So the numbers of people that are actually the lawmakers, the people who are in the legislative, depend on the country, okay? So for example, to give example from the United States. The U.S. has a bicameral legislature. They have a two-house system, two houses. The two houses in the United States are the House of Representatives, which has 435 members, and the Senate, which has 100 members. Okay? So altogether, this makes up Congress. So Congress, another way of putting it, is separated into two houses. And those two houses, House of Reps and the Senate. Okay? So again, legislature is a group of people making pass laws. How is it structured in the United States? Here. Okay? And this is a picture of the U.S. Capitol building, if you're not aware. So that's the legislative in a nutshell. Then we have executive. Okay? So the executive branch is important because typically in the executive branch, you find the person with the most political power. That's the top executive. So what I mean by most political power is they have the biggest decision-making abilities. Like there's a lot of people who have big decision-making capabilities in government. That's kind of what government does. They make big decisions. But the top executive is the one with the most, the one with the most political power. So that's the top executive. So most common top executives that you see in countries are presidents are pretty common to see as the person with the most political power is the top executive. Example, that would be in the United States, our top executive is our president. Prime ministers are also common. Example would be the United Kingdom. So a prime minister can be the top executive or the person with the most political power as well. Okay, so it depends on the system of government. It depends on what type of government they have. Many countries have democracies, but they're not necessarily all the same type of democracy. So you kind of have to look at how the government works. And even, gets even slightly confusing, some countries have a president and a prime minister. But just because they have both doesn't mean they're equally shared or one necessarily gets the power. It depends on the system. So sometimes the prime minister has more power, sometimes the president would have more power, and that's something you might have to look into, especially when you're doing your research towards the end of the quarter. Now, applying this towards Israel, okay, after our general facts. So first off, there are 6 districts in Israel, and here are the 6 districts. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, okay? Israel does have a democratic form of government, meaning the democratic form of government usually encourage freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and people vote for who they want to represent them. Now, their type of democratic government is a parliamentary democracy. So they have a parliament system. They have a democracy, but it's a parliament type, okay? So what are their branches of government going to look like then? Okay, so what is the legislative structure or how is it set up? So if I ask you, what's the structure of the legislative branch? All I'm asking for is how it's set up, okay? I'm not asking you for their jobs or their responsibilities. I'm asking you just how it's set up. It's kind of like on a soccer field. If I asked you, how many players are on the field, you would tell me, well, we have 2, in the front, 2 in the middle, 2 behind as defenders. You're not telling me their goals or their job or their responsibilities. You're just saying where they are. It's the structure. How is it set up? So in Israel, how is it set up? So remember, a legislative group is a group of people who make and pass laws. It's a group. There's a bunch of people and they talk about laws and making laws. Okay. So how is it set up? How is it structured in Israel? They have what's known as the Knesset. Okay. Our group of lawmakers is called Congress, okay? So theirs is the Knesset. That's a hard K. They have 120 members. It's unicameral. It's one house. So where we have 2 houses, we separate our group into 2 groups. We separate our Congress into 2 groups. They just have 1 house. Now, keep in mind, they do have a smaller population. So in some ways, that would make sense. You don't need a whole bunch of representatives for a smaller population. So it's unicameral. It's 1 house. So this is a picture of the building where they meet and pass laws, okay? And that's where the Knesset meets. Or you can call it their parliament. So parliament would be more of a general term, and the Knesset is the specific term for Israel, okay? So that's their legislative structure, the group of people who make and pass laws. And again, this is a parliament system, so slightly out of order there. I apologize. So a parliament system, their specific parliament is called the Knesset. Now, executive. So typically in the executive branch, like I mentioned, you find the person with the most political power, their top executive. So in Israel, because they have a parliamentary democracy, a parliament system, so the person with the most political power is almost always the top executive. In a parliament system, the top executive is almost always going to be the prime minister. Okay? So that's a good thing to keep in mind, because some of your countries that you'll research, you'll have to figure out who has the most political power. And if you take a look at the type of government, that might lead you into knowing who has the most decision-making power. Okay? So the prime minister of Israel, currently, it's this guy pictured here on the right, this charming-looking gentleman. This is Benjamin Netanyahu. Okay? Now, in a lot of parliament systems with prime ministers, they don't have like a limit of terms they can stay in. So the American presidency, our top decision maker, they're limited. They can only be at most 2 terms. In a parliament system, their prime minister can keep on serving and keep on getting reelected. So Benjamin Netanyahu is actually currently on his 5th term as prime minister of Israel. But he is the top executive. He is the person with the most political power in Israel. Okay? So to do a quick compare and contrast, kind of like outline what we've been talking about. So each country has these 3 branches. It's a matter of applying what they look like in the country. So in the United States, to recap, they have a legislative branch. But in the United States, we have Congress. It has 2 houses within the houses, or 2 houses within Congress, so that would make it bicameral. In Israel, they have a parliament. Okay, the specific name would be the Knesset. It's 1 house, meaning it's unicameral. Uni 1 by 2. Uni 1 by 2. Okay. Executive branch. The top executive, or the person with the most political power in the United States, is the president. Okay, that's how our system of government works. Our president is our biggest decision maker, the person with the most political power. In Israel, the person with the most political power, because they have a parliament system, is the prime minister. Now you'll notice, wait a second, judicial branch, that's a branch of government. Why have you not brought that up? Typically, we just don't mention it all that much in class, and when we're talking about what's going on in the country, the judicial branch doesn't come up that much. And so, as to not overwhelm you with too many details, I am just kind of ignoring the judicial branch, but I will say that it is important. Okay? Now, while I'm on the topic of government, something that's kind of interesting in regards to Israel is their Israeli Defense Force. Okay? That is basically their military. Now, what's interesting about Israel is, as we know historically, they have a history of being attacked by their neighbors. Okay, so the question kind of arises that if you're a relatively small country like Israel is, with a relatively small population, which Israel has, how do you adequately defend your country and make sure it's well defended if you live in kind of, as they say, a rough neighborhood? Well, what Israel does is that they require most everyone to serve in the military. Most men are required to serve 3 years. So after high school, you're basically required to join the military. Men serve 3 years, women serve 2 years. Okay? Now, men have to return for several weeks each year until they're 41. The reason being is you don't have to stay in the military. Some people do stay in the military because they like it, they make a career out of it. But after you're done with your 3 or 2 years, you can go off to college, or you can just join the workforce, similar to what we do after high school here. But men have to return for a couple weeks a year if they do leave the military, because they need to keep them up on their training. Because you don't want someone, if they're needed to be called in, you don't want them to be completely rusty on knowing about military, what they're doing, like where they should report, what they should be doing. They're training with guns or strategy or tactics. You don't want that to all go to waste. You want to keep them trained up. So a couple weeks each year they come back. Women do not have to return in Israel. Okay. The last thing having to do with their defense force or their military is Krav Maga. So it says here, Israeli combat system. Okay. So what's interesting to me is that the Israelis actually created their own martial art fighting style. It's called Krav Maga. And the idea was they wanted a really, really brutally effective martial art. So that is to say, there's no flash, there's no show, there's no like forms like you might see in Kung Fu or like karate. It's really end the fight as soon as possible. So this was also a result of this defensive mentality that Israelis have, and that's tied into their history of being on the defensive. Okay, so that's kind of your rundown of learning about the government. So, of course, one reason I also did this as a recording, you can refer back to this should you need to. Okay, please let me know if anything has been confusing or you would like clarification more on anything. Because this will be stuff that we'll be bringing up as far as how governments work over and over again with all of our units. Okay, all right. Thanks for listening.